Hello everyone, this is the lecture for Chapter 21. Chapter 21 deals with the Progressive Era, which is basically the reaction to the previous period, that late 19th century period that we've just been talking about for the beginning of the semester. And this is basically the period where people start to reconsider what's happening in the society, especially with regards to industrialization and how it's affected society. And so this is kind of people's reaction to that. And that's what this chapter deals with. So we will get that started. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is progressivism? Now, progressivism isn't just a single movement. It's really difficult to define as a single movement. Generally speaking, it was a broad-based response to industrialization and all the byproducts of industrialization. So immigration, the growth of urban areas of cities, corporate power, growing corporate power, monopolies, trusts, those sorts of things. And then the class divisions that are sort of taking over the country as well. It differs from populism in that you have the participation of a wider segment of the population. You have more urban people, you have journalists, you have academics, you have public intellectuals, those kind of people getting involved in progressivism, whereas populism was more of a grassroots, rural type of a movement. It is absolutely important to remember, though, that these people were not radicals. They weren't trying to completely change or overturn society as it existed. They wanted to reform it. They simply wanted to make it more humane or more friendly. Now, because you have different segments of this movement, it's not one uniform thing, progressive reformers tended to embrace causes that tended to overlap one another, and even that tended to kind of come in conflict with one another. Stricter business regulation became a big sort of buzzword or buzz phrase, I suppose, in this period. But you have other groups that are also focusing on protecting workers from the sort of dangerous work environments. You have some that are focusing on alleviating urban poverty. You have others that are wanting to reform municipal government. Immigration restriction, also part of the progressive movement. And social control strategies, ideas of sort of controlling people's behavior was part of this movement, and not all of them are complementary with one another. Progressives also tended to believe that social problems could be solved through study and through organized effort, and so they had a high respect for expert knowledge. This produced a new kind of industrial order. And the figuring was that because that expert knowledge was used to make the technologies that changed the society and that created some of these problems, then that same idea, expertise, could be used to fix those social problems that came out of it. Historians like to portray progressivism as a sort of stage, if you like, that societies pass through as they're modernizing. And it's a useful thing to think about, but it's also important to remember that it's not an automatic stage that societies will go through, that it is possible to not have a progressive period. And now the question becomes, who were the progressives, now that we've discussed what the movement was? Along with immigration, you also have a growing middle class, which is transforming cities in the United States. And many of the people in this middle class came to be the leaders and the supporters of the progressive movement. Between 1900 and 1920, you have a massive leap in the number of white-collar workers that you have in the city, and it's from those groups that this movement is coming from. And you also have professional groups being created among these white-collar workers, and that's a big part of the membership there. Women also play a huge role in the progressive movement. Young unmarried women are taking on these white-collar jobs, and they're college-educated. Largely, or large populations of them are college educated, and so they play a big part in this. Middle-class married women also play a big part in this, and the idea that goes along with the progressive movement, the new woman, kind of trying to redefine gender roles, if you like. You also have native-born middle-class members, people who are found to be sort of allies in promoting reform, issues that affected factory workers and slum dwellers and the urban immigrant political machines. Often took the initiative in dealing with those type of issues. So you see a lot of input from them. And even some corporate leaders promoted business regulations that they found served their own interests. In the previous period, the one we've just finished talking about, referred to as the Gilded Age, intellectuals argued that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution could be applied to society. It was known as social Darwinism. And this was an idea that justified the unrestrained economic competition that we see during the Gilded Age. But as we move into the Progressive Era, the dissenting voices with regards to social Darwinism become more numerous in the Progressive period, and the attacks on social Darwinism become more intense after 1900. And if we look at some of the specific individuals doing these attacks, the first of these was a Norwegian American, someone who is from Norway. He was in Minnesota and wrote a publication called The Theory of the Leisure Class, where he basically talks about these upper middle class capitalists and their lifestyle, and kind of satirizes the way that they live their life, and their conspicuous consumption and the way that they flaunt their wealth. Also involved with this, you have a Harvard philosopher, William James, who argues in his publication Pragmatism that the truth emerges not from abstract theorizing but from experience of coping with life's realities through practical action. And so is, I suppose you could say, very connected to the idea of the settlement house movement, that dealing with practical problems. This also tends to reveal the reformers in this period skepticism toward the older generation's ideas, entrenched ideas, and kind of justified the belief in the need for social change as well. Another individual, Herbert Crawley, was the son of a reform-minded journalist, and also believed that new ideas could transform society. In his publication, The Promise of American Life, he called for an activist government, a government which takes an active role in changing society or in improving society, and came to the conclusion that the government just offering the bare minimum of order and independence and individual liberty and things like that was not enough, and he promoted the idea that the government should be concerned with the welfare of everyone. Jane Addams was the founder of the Settlement House in Chicago, and she published Democracy and Social Ethics, where she rejected the claim that competition would ensure social progress, and that stated that in such a complex industrial society, an individual's well-being now depends on the well-being of the whole society, kind of a herd mentality, if you like. And emphasizes the interconnectedness of our society. John Dewey was an educational reformer, and he saw the schools as a potential place for social change. And in his publication, Democracy and Education, he talks about pupils working collaboratively and creating what he called an embryonic community where children would learn to live as members of a larger social group. And then lastly, in this group of specific people, you have Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice, and actually a justice who tends to be a dissenting voice from the conservative majority. I can only think of one time where he was less than progressive in his thinking. But in his publication, The Common Law, he actively says that the law has to evolve with society's changes, and so kind of advocates for an activist court, if you like. The idea that the court would interpret laws based on the needs of society, and not be so rigidly held to tradition in that way. You also have in this period a collection of novelists who wrote fictional novels that, while the stories and the people were often not true, they were quite often based in reality. The Octopus by Frank Norris portrayed the railroad barons in the state of California and their kind of dirty dealings, if you like, with farmers there especially. And then along with those novelists, you also have a number of journalists who are writing exposés, if you like, of American society or of parts of American society. This kind of investigative journalism was given the title muckraker, or the people who participated in this or did this type of journalism were given the label muckraker by President Roosevelt, and it was meant as a criticism, but it became something of a badge of honor for these people. And as the picture would suggest, it's a picture showing Theodore Roosevelt holding a muck rake in there. The muck that he's raking is labeled the meat scandal. It was one of the things that Roosevelt did during his presidency. The Jungle, I believe, was published by Upton Sinclair, and upon reading it, Roosevelt was just appalled at the state of the meat packing industry, and so had an investigation done by Congress, and the report he got was so horrible that he actually threatened the people who owned the meatpacking companies with exposure if they didn't sort of clean up their act. And so he actually ended up utilizing the skills of the muckrakers quite extensively during his presidency. He had definitely an activist type presidency. So beginning in the 1890s, middle-class reformers began battling the corrupt city governments that are providing services and jobs to immigrants. But the price of this is often fraud-ridden elections. And so a lot of them began turning their attention to reforming municipal government itself. And a lot of their focus was on the kind of private monopolies that ran city services like water, electricity, gas, and public transportation. And what they planned to do with these was to take these utilities, these services, and put them in the hands of the community, the city itself, rather than in the hands of private corporations. Kind of got the nickname of utility socialism because that was the idea behind it. And so they got laws passed that would regulate these utilities. Reformers also began advocating for professional city managers rather than mayors, and councils that would be chosen in citywide elections for aldermen that were elected on a sort of ward-by-ward basis. This was sort of reflecting that insistence or that dependence on expert advice and efficiency. These experts were supposed to be above politics, and so be able to run the city like you would a business, efficiently. Municipal reform attracted many different groups, and it usually depended on the issue that was in question. Native-born middle class that were led by the clergy for the most part, editors of newspapers, and various other groups provided the sort of core support for the reforms. Business interests would push for citywide elections, as well as a city manager system, because these changes would reduce the immigrants' political clout and increase the influence of the corporate elite. Reforms also promised improved services and better conditions, or reforms that did promise that, also won support of immigrants and political bosses. And so you have a variety of different people advocating for these reforms in municipal government. The electoral reform movement also spread to the state level, so it wasn't just on the city level, it was on the state level as well. By 1910, all the states had replaced the old system of voting that had pre-printed ballots with the names of specific candidates with a secret ballot system, which would make it much more difficult to rig elections. The direct primary was introduced in Wisconsin, which enabled the rank and file to select party candidates for public offices rather than party bosses. And hoping to trim political power of corporate interests, some Western states even introduced the initiative, referendum, and recall ideas. Initiative was where voters could instruct the legislature to consider a specific bill. Referendum was that citizens could actually vote to enact a law or express their views, kind of like direct democracy. And recall was that voters could petition to remove a public official from office. This was aimed at democratizing voting. Party leaders, interest groups, all soon learned to manipulate the system, though, with machinery of their own, and so it was relatively easy for them to overcome. The new procedures may also have weakened party loyalty and actually served to reduce voter interest as participation rates dropped sharply after this point. The picture here, I think, is very interesting, though, and it kind of shows a look at these new introductions, specifically the referendum idea, where voters would actually vote on policies. And so you have three voters here. The one on the left is representing a gentleman from Glasgow in Scotland, and he's talking about that he has only like one name on his card, and he puts a check mark by it, and he votes, and he's happy, and it's really easy for him. And you can see he looks happy and relaxed, all in his golfing gear. And then the middle one there is from somewhere else. I'm sorry, I can't actually read the city, but he's got a voting card. It's got 5 names on it or something. He's like, oh, I just picked one of these 5. It's really easy, and I'm quite happy. And then you have a poor guy there from Oregon, I believe, who was like, I mean, I've got all these different names. I've got hundreds of laws I have to decide, and he looks really belaguered and tired and everything. And so this is definitely meant to be a commentary and promoting the idea that perhaps you can get too much democratic involvement in the lawmaking process. Regulating business was a very important part of the progressive movement. So the corporate consolidation that was a defining characteristic of the Gilded Age and produced giants like Carnegie Steel and Standard Oil continues after 1900. And while a lot of workers benefited from this corporate growth, real wages rose considerably in this period. The problem is that those wages were still barely enough to support a family, and definitely didn't allow for saving for a rainy day or anything like that. In order to survive, quite often entire families would have to go to work, and that was mothers, fathers, and even young children having to go to work. In 1910, non-farm labor, the labor force, non-farm labor force, included about 1.6 million children between the ages of 10 to 15, but that number is quite likely to be higher because a lot of people who were categorized as women workers were actually, in fact, young girls between the ages of 10 and 15. So the number is probably off a little bit. However, 1.6 million is quite a large number regardless. The work that these people and these children had to do was extremely dangerous, and the days tended to be very long. Despite the 8-hour workday movement, the average worker still usually spent about 9.5 hours a day at their jobs, and in some southern textile mills, workers were required to work 12 or even 13-hour work days. In a typical year, you would have over 4,000 railroad workers and over 3,000 miners killed on their job because of poor health and safety, and very few enjoyed any kind of vacation time or retirement benefits or anything like that. So it wasn't necessarily a pleasant way to make a living. You also have to adjust sort of how you work. The factory system is run largely by machines. You have time clocks, and you have to be very disciplined, more so than you had to be on a farm, and that was a huge adjustment for people as well. And workers tended to resent the constant pressure to speed up and to become more efficient. Efficiency being like the buzzword of the factory system. Americans concerned about social implications of industrialization deplored any idea of unregulated corporate power and the hazards that regularly faced industrial workers, and became an important part of the progressive movement. Under Governor Robert La Follette, Wisconsin was the state that took the lead in regulating the railroads and the mines and other businesses. In 1900, he won the governorship as an independent and challenged the powerful corporate interests. His administration adopted a direct primary system, Railroad Regulatory Commission. He increased corporate taxes, limited campaign spending, and all these different things like this. He consulted professors from the University of Wisconsin. He set up a legislative reference library to help in the writing of new bills. And the whole concept of his administration gained national notoriety and was known as the Wisconsin Idea. If all of this type of reform, corporate regulations, electoral reform, represented the brain of progressivism, the heart of it was improving conditions for people, actually, workers in particular. This also began at the local and state level. In 1907, for example, 30 states had already outlawed child labor. And in 1903, Oregon even passed a law that limited the amount of time women could work. Campaigns for industrial safety and better working conditions won support from big city political bosses. For example, Tammany Hall in New York led an investigation into a fire at a factory there, the Triangle Fire. And following that investigation and the efforts put in by that committee, New York passed about 56 new worker protection laws. Another individual, Florence Kelley of Hull House, which was a settlement house, she spearheaded the drive to remedy industrial abuses. She persuaded Illinois' legislature to outlaw child labor and limit the working hours for women as well, and even became the head of the National Consumers League to organize pressure for improved factory conditions on the part of consumers. You also have others like Alison Hamilton, who was a bacteriologist, who pioneered the idea of industrial hygiene. She reported on things like lead poisoning among industrial workers and publicized various other work-related medical hazards. But the workers themselves also tended to understand these hazards and so provided further pressure for reform as far as hygiene went. The last thing we'll talk about in this section is the cities themselves and how improvements were made or at least attempted in cities. By 1920, the U.S. urban population officially passes the 50% mark, although that number may be a bit misleading. They tended to consider a town the size of Groesbeck or Mexia to be urban, and that's probably not entirely true. But you do have about 68 cities with a population of more than 100,000 people, and then you have cities with over 1 million people living in them by 1920, so you do have a huge urban shift. Political corruption was one of many urban problems. Businesses attracted a tide of immigrants and job seekers, and so a lot of cities become essentially congested and disgusting human warehouses almost. A lot of reformers campaigned for features like parks and wide boulevards and streetlights. They opposed things like billboards and overhead electrical wires, and just basically wanted to make cities much more attractive as part of their contribution. One architect by the name of Daniel Burnham published a description, what was called the Plan of Chicago in 1909, and offered a vision for that city that was both more efficient and more beautiful. He recommended wide boulevards, lakefront parks, museums, statuary, fountains. All of this would cost about $300 million for the city of Chicago. But it was a very common trend among urban planners, the idea that more beautiful cities and imposing public buildings would produce orderly and law-abiding citizens. The municipal reform impulse also included practical goals, so less fanciful, like the beautification projects, but things like better garbage collection and decent housing and indoor toilets with plumbing and things like that. So they were much more practical and perhaps a little bit more useful. In the 1880s, it was discovered that germs were the cause of a lot of diseases like cholera and typhoid, and so municipal hygiene became a much more of a priority. And apologies there, I seem to have left an I out of hygiene on the slide, so apologies for that. But you see reformers in this period who distribute public health information. They promote vaccine programs for schools, safer water and sewer systems, regulation of food and beverage supplies, and things like that, all in an effort to try and isolate and improve hygiene in cities. These efforts did bear fruit. Between 1900 and 1920, infant mortality rate declines pretty rapidly, as well as deaths related to tuberculosis and typhoid and other infectious and communicable diseases. All of this falls off quite sharply, so it was very much an improvement. Another part of this was environmental awareness. By the early 1900s, physicians had linked factory smoke to respiratory problems, and you see movements to try and clean up the air around cities. Anti-smoke campaigns combine expertise with activism, which was pretty common for progressivism. Smoke Prevention Association was established in 1906, and researchers at the University of Pittsburgh, which was one of the worst polluted cities, documented the hazards and costs of air pollution. You also have women's clubs becoming involved, and you see a lot of cities pass smoke abatement laws as a result. This doesn't go completely unchallenged. A lot of big businesses, railroads, and corporations are fighting back in the courts, and really cities remain smoky for quite a number of years after this as well.